A soldier? How embarrassing. Those were the first words my younger sister said when she saw me, and by the time the wedding guests started laughing, I realized that keeping my promise to my late father was about to cost me far more than a little public embarrassment. My name is Isla Hernandez. I am 41 years old, and for the last 18 years I have served in the United States Air Force. People often imagine military life as loud ceremonies, medals, and dramatic missions, but most days are built on discipline, quiet responsibility, and promises you refuse to break, even when nobody else understands them. One of those promises brought me to Charleston, South Carolina, on a warm Saturday afternoon in early May. The drive from Joint Base Charleston to Seaside Oaks Resort took barely 30 minutes, yet it felt much longer because I spent every mile thinking about my father. He had passed away 14 months earlier after a long battle with heart disease. During our final conversation, he squeezed my hand, smiled with the same quiet pride I remembered from childhood, and told me something I had replayed in my mind countless times since then. If one of your sister's biggest days comes after I'm gone, wear your uniform for me. I won't be there to see it, but I'll know you kept your word. My father had been a firefighter for nearly 30 years. He believed uniforms represented service, not ego. He taught both his daughters that respect was earned through actions, not appearances. I had never imagined that honoring his final request would become the center of someone else's ridicule. I parked my dark blue sedan beneath a row of towering live oak trees draped with Spanish moss. The wedding venue overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, with white chairs already lined up in perfect rows facing a flower-covered arbor. Elegant guests wandered across the lawn carrying sparkling drinks while a string quartet rehearsed softly beneath a large ivory canopy. Everyone looked relaxed, polished, and ready for a beautiful celebration. I stepped out of the car wearing my Air Force dress blue uniform, every ribbon perfectly aligned, every button polished, my service cap tucked carefully beneath one arm until the ceremony began. I wasn't trying to stand out. In fact, military etiquette had taught me to avoid unnecessary attention whenever possible. My goal was simple: attend my sister's wedding, congratulate the newlyweds, keep my promise to Dad, then quietly head back to base before sunrise the next morning because I was scheduled to brief my commander at 800 hours. I had barely reached the stone walkway leading toward the reception hall when I heard a familiar laugh. Brianna stood near the entrance surrounded by 4 bridesmaids, her white wedding gown catching the afternoon sunlight. She looked stunning, exactly as every bride hopes to look on her wedding day. For just a second, I smiled because despite everything that had happened between us over the years, she was still my little sister. Then her smile disappeared. Her eyes traveled from my polished shoes to my ribbons before stopping at my jacket. She folded her arms across her chest and laughed loudly enough for several nearby guests to turn around. "Isla. Seriously?" she said. "You actually came dressed like that?" A few bridesmaids exchanged uncertain glances before one covered her mouth to hide an awkward smile. Another whispered something I couldn't hear, and they all began chuckling together. I kept my expression calm. "Good afternoon, Brianna," I replied warmly. "You look beautiful." Instead of accepting the compliment, she rolled her eyes dramatically. "Don't change the subject," she said. "You couldn't find a normal dress?" More guests paused to watch. Conversations slowed. Someone near the registration table quietly nudged another guest toward us. I could feel dozens of curious eyes settling on my uniform. "This is what Dad wanted," I answered simply. "I'm keeping a promise." Brianna let out a short laugh. "Dad isn't here anymore, Isla. This is my wedding, not an Air Force recruiting commercial." The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were loud, but because they dismissed the one person who would have understood exactly why I came dressed this way. I could have explained further. I could have mentioned Dad's final request. I could have listed every reason this uniform mattered to me. Instead, I stayed silent. Military service teaches you that not every misunderstanding deserves an argument. Sometimes dignity is quieter than defense. One bridesmaid leaned closer to Brianna and whispered, "Is she really wearing medals to your ceremony?" Brianna nodded dramatically. Apparently being a soldier is her whole personality. Several people laughed again. I noticed an older couple exchange uncomfortable looks before quietly walking away toward the reception tent. Even they seemed unsure whether they should be watching this conversation. My hands remained relaxed at my sides. My breathing stayed steady. Inside, however, disappointment settled heavily in my chest. I had imagined an emotional reunion. Instead, I had become the afternoon's unexpected entertainment before the ceremony had even begun. Brianna shook her head one last time. Honestly, she said with a sarcastic smile, a soldier? How embarrassing. The sentence hung in the warm coastal air just long enough for another ripple of laughter to spread through the nearby guests. Before I could answer, I noticed movement across the courtyard. A tall man in a tailored navy suit had just stepped out from the reception building carrying a folder beneath one arm. He looked toward the commotion, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to focused attention the instant his eyes settled on my uniform, and for reasons I couldn't yet explain, he stopped walking altogether. The laughter gradually faded as more guests realized the exchange had become uncomfortable rather than amusing, but Brianna was not finished. She stepped closer, lowered her voice just enough to sound polite while making certain everyone nearby could still hear every word, and smiled the way people do when they believe they are being completely reasonable. Isla, I worked for almost a year planning this wedding. Every photograph is going to be framed in our house forever. Could you please change into something less official? I looked at her quietly before answering. I did not bring another outfit. She blinked. You are telling me you drove all the way here with only that uniform? Yes. She sighed dramatically and looked toward her bridesmaids. See what I mean? She always has to make everything different. One of the bridesmaids tried to lighten the mood by saying, maybe the hotel gift shop has something. Another laughed softly. Or maybe somebody has a black sundress. I appreciated that neither woman sounded cruel, only uncomfortable, but Brianna interpreted their comments as support. Exactly, she replied. Anything would be better than this. I kept my voice calm. I am not trying to distract from your wedding. Whether you mean to or not, you are, Brianna answered. People are already staring. She was not wrong. Several guests walking toward the ceremony paused for a second look before continuing toward the lawn. Most simply seemed curious. A military dress uniform was uncommon at a civilian wedding, unless someone in the bridal party was serving. Unfortunately, Brianna interpreted every glance as proof that I was stealing attention from her. Before I could answer, our mother, Shirley Hernandez, approached carrying a clipboard and speaking with one of the wedding coordinators. She dismissed the coordinator with a quick smile before turning toward us. What is going on? She asked. Brianna answered first. Mom, she actually came wearing her uniform. Shirley looked me up and down without saying anything for several seconds. Finally she exhaled slowly. Isla, sweetheart. Today is Brianna's day. I know. Then please help make it easier. I already am. She frowned slightly. How? By being here. Her expression hardened just enough for me to recognize the conversation was no longer about practicality. It was about appearances. People are going to think you are trying to make some kind of statement, she said. I am not making a statement. Then change clothes. I cannot. Shirley folded her arms. Why not? I looked at both of them before quietly answering. Because I made Dad a promise. For just a brief moment neither of them spoke. Brianna looked away first. We have talked about this before, she said. Dad loved both of us. He did. Then stop using him to justify every decision you make. Her words hurt more than I wanted to admit, but arguing would only create another scene. Instead I simply nodded. I hope your ceremony is beautiful. She threw her hands into the air. You are impossible. At that exact moment the wedding planner hurried over and announced that guests should begin taking their seats within 15 minutes. The conversation ended only because the schedule demanded it. Brianna walked away with her bridesmaids while Shirley followed after her, still shaking her head. I remained near the entrance for a moment, adjusting one cuff before placing my service cap back beneath my arm. I reminded myself why I had come. I was not here to win an argument. I was here because family mattered even when family forgot how to show kindness. As I started toward the ceremony lawn, I noticed the same tall man from across the courtyard speaking with several groomsmen. His posture immediately caught my attention. Years in uniform teach you to recognize military bearing almost instinctively. He stood straight without appearing stiff, scanning the area naturally instead of nervously, greeting older guests with genuine respect rather than rehearsed charm. Someone beside me quietly whispered, "That is Logan Pierce. He is the groom." Another guest added proudly, "United States Navy SEAL Captain. Everyone says he is one of the best officers in his community." I nodded politely and continued walking. I had no reason to introduce myself. This was his wedding day, not a networking event between service members. Still, as I found my assigned seat near the back row, I noticed him glance toward me again from nearly 40 feet away. This time his attention was not on my face. His eyes settled briefly on the decorations above my left pocket before moving to the small qualification badge above my ribbons. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, as though he had noticed something unexpected. Then one of his friends called his name, breaking his concentration, and he turned away to continue greeting arriving guests. I told myself it meant nothing. Military personnel often notice details civilians overlooked. The ceremony would begin soon, everyone would focus on Brianna, and the awkward confrontation at the entrance would become nothing more than an uncomfortable memory. Yet only a few minutes later, while the string quartet rehearsed the opening notes once again, I happened to look toward the front of the seating area and realized Logan was no longer talking to his friends. Instead, he was quietly looking across the rows of white chairs directly at me with the unmistakable expression of someone trying very hard to remember where he had seen my uniform before. The ceremony began precisely on schedule as the afternoon sun settled over the Atlantic, casting warm light across the white chairs and flower-lined aisle. The music drifted gently through the sea breeze, and for a little while everyone seemed to forget the awkward scene that had unfolded near the entrance. I remained seated near the back, exactly where my place card had directed me, quietly watching guests smile as they waited for Brianna to walk down the aisle. Weddings have a way of softening even difficult moments, and I hoped that by the end of the afternoon my sister would remember the joy of marrying someone she loved instead of worrying about what I happened to be wearing. Logan stood beside the officiant looking every bit the composed naval officer. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, but it was his posture that gave him away. Even without a uniform, military bearing never disappears. As the music changed and Brianna appeared at the end of the aisle holding our mother's arm, every guest rose to their feet. She looked radiant, and despite everything that had happened earlier, I genuinely smiled. She deserved a beautiful wedding day. The ceremony itself was heartfelt and simple. They exchanged personal vows, laughed softly at a few nervous moments, and promised to build a life based on trust and respect. Those words lingered in my mind. Trust and respect. I wondered if Brianna realized how much she had spoken about those values while forgetting to offer them to her own family. Still, I pushed the thought away. This was not the time to dwell on hurt feelings. When the officiant finally introduced them as husband and wife, applause filled the lawn, cameras flashed, and everyone followed the newlyweds toward the reception pavilion overlooking the water. The reception began with cocktails on the terrace, while photographers organized family portraits. I deliberately stayed out of the way, chatting briefly with an elderly couple seated near me who mentioned their grandson had recently joined the Air Force. They asked polite questions about basic training and military life, and our conversation felt refreshingly normal. They saw a service member, not a distraction. A few minutes later, one of Logan's fellow officers approached carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He introduced himself as Commander Ryan Ellis and thanked me for my service before excusing himself to rejoin the wedding party. The interaction lasted less than a minute, but from across the terrace I noticed Brianna watching us with visible frustration. She whispered something to one of her bridesmaids before turning away. It was becoming increasingly clear that every ordinary conversation involving me looked suspicious through the lens of her insecurity. During the cocktail hour, guests naturally gathered into small circles, discussing careers, travel, and family. Someone eventually asked Logan about his military experiences. He answered modestly, carefully avoiding operational details while describing the importance of teamwork. The conversation soon shifted toward a recent humanitarian rescue mission in Alaska that had received national media attention. One guest enthusiastically said, "I read that the weather was impossible. Whoever planned that operation must have been incredible." Logan nodded thoughtfully. "The conditions were extremely difficult," he replied. From what I heard, the rescue team adjusted their extraction point after unexpected crosswinds developed over the glacier. Several guests listened with fascination. I quietly sipped my tea without intending to participate. Then Logan added, I believe they also delayed the second helicopter launch by about 15 minutes to improve visibility. I instinctively looked up. It was a small detail but not quite accurate. Before I had time to think, years of professional habit quietly surfaced. Actually, I said gently, the launch delay was closer to 9 minutes. Waiting any longer would have narrowed the safe weather window too much. The conversation stopped immediately. Logan looked directly at me. That was not what I was briefed. I smiled politely. Public summaries often simplify the timeline. Nobody else seemed to notice the significance of the exchange, but I did. Military operational timelines are not random facts discussed at social events. They are usually learned through first-hand experience or official briefings. Logan studied me for several silent seconds before giving a respectful nod. That is an interesting observation. I simply smiled and changed the subject by asking one of the guests whether they had traveled far for the wedding. The conversation gradually resumed, but I could still feel Logan thinking about my answer. That brief correction should have meant nothing to anyone else. To someone with military experience, however, it raised an entirely different question. How could a quiet Air Force captain attending her sister's wedding know such a specific operational detail that had never appeared in any public report? As lunch was served, I deliberately chose a table near the edge of the reception area instead of sitting with the bridal party. I wanted Brianna to enjoy her afternoon without feeling that I was competing for attention. While guests laughed over speeches and shared family stories, I quietly enjoyed the ocean view. Halfway through the meal, I noticed Logan excuse himself from another table. Instead of returning to Brianna immediately, he walked over to a retired gentleman I had not met earlier, speaking with him in low, serious tones. The older man briefly glanced toward me before nodding thoughtfully. Whatever they discussed lasted less than a minute, but when Logan turned back toward the reception, his expression had completely changed. It was no longer simple curiosity. It was the focused look of someone trying to solve a puzzle. A few moments later, as servers cleared the lunch plates and guests prepared for the wedding speeches, Logan quietly picked up the printed reception program from an empty chair, looked from the program to me once again, and narrowed his eyes after reading my full name for what appeared to be the very first time. As the reception settled into an easy rhythm, servers refilled glasses of iced tea and coffee while conversations drifted from family memories to careers and travel. A gentle breeze rolled in from the Atlantic, carrying the sound of waves beyond the dunes, and for the first time that afternoon I allowed myself to believe the tension might finally fade into the background. I remained at my table near the terrace, quietly watching children chase each other across the lawn while older relatives exchanged stories about weddings from decades earlier. It was exactly the kind of peaceful afternoon my father would have enjoyed. Then I noticed Logan walking toward my table with the same calm confidence he had shown throughout the ceremony. Unlike the curious glances from earlier, this time his expression carried genuine professional interest rather than casual observation. He stopped beside my chair and smiled politely. "Captain Hernandez?" he asked. I stood and returned the smile. "Yes. Would you mind if I joined you for a minute?" "Of course not." He took the empty chair across from me while several nearby guests continued talking among themselves, paying little attention to us. "I hope my questions are not intrusive," he began, "but I have been trying to remember where I might have heard your name before." I laughed softly. "There are a lot of Hernandezes in the military." "That is true," he admitted, "but not many with your combination of qualifications." His eyes briefly settled on my uniform again before returning to my face. There was no arrogance in his tone, only quiet curiosity. "How long have you been serving?" 18 years. "Mostly stateside?" "Some stateside. Some overseas. A mixture of operational assignments and leadership positions." He nodded thoughtfully. "Leadership. That has been part of my career." I intentionally kept every answer simple. Years in uniform had taught me never to discuss assignments beyond what was appropriate in public settings. Logan appeared to respect that boundary. Instead of pressing for classified details, he changed direction. Earlier you mentioned the Alaska rescue timeline. I smiled politely, only because the timing caught my attention. It caught mine too, he replied. Most people would not notice the difference between 9 minutes and 15. I shrugged lightly. Details matter. He leaned back slightly, studying my expression rather than my ribbons now. They certainly do. Before either of us could continue, Brianna walked past our table carrying a bouquet that had been temporarily set aside after photographs. She stopped when she saw us talking. Seriously, she said with a forced laugh. Even during my reception? Logan looked genuinely confused. We were just talking. About military things, I assume, Brianna answered. You two probably have plenty in common. I answered calmly. He asked about my career. Brianna smiled toward Logan, but the smile never reached her eyes. Trust me, she can talk about being in the Air Force for hours. I chose not to respond. Logan glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension without understanding its history. Brianna quickly excused herself to greet another group of guests, but not before giving me one final disappointed look. As she disappeared into the crowd, Logan quietly said, I hope I did not create a problem. You did not. Your sister seems concerned. She has a lot on her mind today. He accepted the answer without pushing further. After a brief pause, he asked another question. Have you ever worked with Joint Special Operations units? It was an ordinary question between military professionals, yet the answer required careful wording. A few times, I replied. Mostly during humanitarian coordination. Interesting. He rested one hand on the table as though thinking through several possibilities at once. Then perhaps we have crossed paths without realizing it. I smiled. That happens more often than people think. A wedding coordinator suddenly approached and politely asked Logan to prepare for the formal speeches. He stood, thanked me for the conversation, and started walking away before unexpectedly turning back. One last question, Captain. Certainly. During that Alaska operation, what would have happened if the second aircraft had actually launched 6 minutes later than it did? For the first time all afternoon I hesitated. The answer was not classified, but it was specific enough that only someone deeply familiar with the mission would know to ask it. Finally I replied in the same calm voice I had used throughout our conversation. The rescue team would have reached the mountain after the weather window closed. Several families might have received very different phone calls that evening. Logan's expression froze for just an instant. He gave a slow nod without saying another word before walking toward the head table. As I watched him leave, I wondered why that simple answer seemed to affect him so deeply. The reception continued with applause as the best man welcomed everyone and thanked them for celebrating the newlyweds. Guests laughed through childhood stories about Brianna and Logan, and for a while the mood returned to joyful celebration. Yet from across the ballroom, I noticed Logan glance toward me several more times, no longer with curiosity but with growing certainty. Then, halfway through the best man's toast, an older gentleman with neatly combed silver hair entered the reception a little later than everyone else. The moment Logan saw him, he excused himself from the bridal table, walked directly across the room, and quietly greeted the distinguished guest before discreetly pointing in my direction. The older man's eyes immediately found me across the crowded ballroom, and instead of looking surprised, he slowly straightened his posture as though he had just recognized someone he never expected to see at his future daughter-in-law's wedding. The arrival of the distinguished older gentleman subtly changed the atmosphere around the reception without most guests realizing why. He carried himself with quiet confidence rather than ceremony, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with a simple American flag lapel pin. His silver hair was neatly combed, and although his face showed the lines of age, his posture reflected decades of military discipline that retirement had never erased. Logan greeted him warmly before speaking in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear. I could not make out the conversation, but I noticed Logan glance toward me twice while the gentleman listened carefully without interrupting. After less than a minute, the older man nodded once and slowly made his way across the ballroom. I remained seated, assuming he was simply greeting another guest. Instead, he stopped beside my table with a polite smile. "Captain Hernandez?" he asked. I immediately stood. "Yes, sir." He extended his hand. Ronald Sanchez. The name immediately sounded familiar. Several years earlier, I had attended a leadership conference where retired Brigadier General Ronald Sanchez had spoken about joint service cooperation during humanitarian operations. Although we had never met personally, his reputation throughout the Air Force was exceptional. "It is an honor to meet you, General Sanchez," I said respectfully. He smiled. "Retirement means Ronald is perfectly acceptable now." We shook hands before he gestured toward the empty chair. "May I? Please." Logan quietly joined us a moment later, looking more curious than ever. Ronald folded his hands comfortably on the table. "Logan tells me you have served for 18 years. "Yes, sir. And he also tells me you corrected a very specific operational timeline earlier this afternoon." I smiled modestly. "Only a small detail." Ronald studied me carefully, not with suspicion but with professional interest. In my experience, small details often reveal large truths. Before I could answer, one of the servers delivered fresh coffee to the table. The brief interruption allowed the surrounding conversations to continue uninterrupted. Nobody nearby seemed aware that an unusually serious military discussion was quietly taking place during a wedding reception. Ronald took a sip before asking another gentle question. "May I ask what field has occupied most of your career?" "Search and rescue, air mobility support, and joint humanitarian operations." Logan looked thoughtful. "That explains part of it." Ronald nodded slowly. "Only part." I remained silent. Neither man appeared interested in personal recognition. They were trying to solve a professional puzzle. Ronald leaned slightly closer. "Captain Hernandez, years ago I reviewed reports from several large-scale rescue missions. Your name feels familiar, although I cannot immediately place it." I answered honestly. "Many people worked on those operations." "Yes," Ronald replied, "but very few consistently served in leadership positions." Before I could respond, applause interrupted the conversation as the master of ceremonies invited everyone to direct their attention toward the dance floor for additional wedding speeches. Ronald smiled politely. "Duty calls even at weddings." Logan stood with us. "Would you both mind if we continued this conversation afterward?" "Of course," I answered. As they walked back toward the head table, I quietly returned to my seat. Something about the conversation lingered in my thoughts. Logan was no longer simply curious about another service member. He was carefully connecting details that most civilians would never notice. Halfway through the maid of honor speech, I happened to glance toward the head table. Logan had opened his phone beneath the tablecloth, shielding the screen from nearby guests. His eyes moved rapidly across what appeared to be an article or archived report before lifting briefly toward me again. Whatever he had found caused him to slowly lower the phone without finishing his coffee. A small feeling of concern settled in my mind. I hoped he was not spending his own wedding reception researching another officer instead of enjoying the celebration with Brianna. The speeches continued with laughter and heartfelt memories from childhood friends. Brianna seemed genuinely happy again, smiling as guests applauded each story. Watching her laugh reminded me why I had remained patient throughout the day. Family relationships are complicated. Sometimes people say hurtful things because they are anxious rather than cruel. I wanted to believe that once the excitement faded, she and I would eventually find our way back to each other. Following the speeches, guests spread throughout the ballroom while the newlyweds greeted each table individually. When Brianna finally reached mine with Logan beside her, she smiled politely for the benefit of nearby relatives. "I hope you are enjoying yourself now," she said. "I am," I replied sincerely. "Congratulations again." Logan looked at me for a brief moment before speaking. "Captain Hernandez, would you mind answering one more professional question?" Brianna laughed lightly. "Still talking about military work?" "Just one question," Logan said politely. I nodded. "Go ahead." He looked directly into my eyes. "Have you ever coordinated fixed-wing support during mountain extractions?" "Yes." "Including operations involving multiple civilian rescue agencies?" "Yes." Brianna sighed dramatically. "I have absolutely no idea what either of you are talking about." Neither of us answered immediately. Logan's expression grew more serious. "Then perhaps you can help me settle something I have wondered about for years." He paused just long enough for my attention to sharpen before continuing. During the Alaska glacier rescue several years ago, the mission commander changed the primary extraction corridor at the last possible minute. Every official briefing described the decision as unconventional, but the final outcome saved every stranded climber. I have always wondered why that commander ignored the recommended route. I answered without hesitation because the lesson itself had never been classified. Because the satellite weather model had updated 6 minutes earlier than the printed briefing package. The original route would have flown directly into severe downdrafts. Logan's face became completely still. Ronald Sanchez, standing only a few feet away speaking with another guest, slowly turned his head toward us after clearly overhearing my explanation. Logan looked back at me with unmistakable disbelief before asking one final question in an almost whispered voice. "Captain, how could you possibly know something that was never included in any official public report?" For a brief moment the sounds of the reception seemed to disappear beneath the quiet weight of Logan's question. He was not challenging me. He was searching for an answer that would reconcile everything he had observed since the moment I arrived. I looked at him calmly before offering the only truthful response that did not exaggerate or seek attention. "Because I was there," I said softly. He blinked once, almost as though he was making certain he had heard me correctly. "There?" he repeated. "Yes. You participated in the operation?" "I did." His expression grew even more focused. "In what capacity?" I hesitated for only a second before answering with complete honesty. "I served as the mission commander." Silence settled between us. The conversation around our table continued, but it suddenly felt very far away. Brianna gave a small laugh, assuming I had made some kind of joke. "Very funny, Isla," she said. "You really know how to keep military conversations interesting." Neither Logan nor I smiled. Ronald Sanchez slowly stepped closer until he stood beside the table. He studied my face for several seconds before speaking in a measured voice. "Captain Hernandez, would you mind telling me the mission call sign?" I answered without hesitation. "Guardian 7. Ronald inhaled slowly. Logan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, then looked back at me with unmistakable respect beginning to replace curiosity. Ronald continued gently. "During the weather update, what phrase did you use before changing the extraction corridor?" I could almost hear my father's voice reminding me never to seek recognition. Even so, the question had been asked directly. I instructed every aircraft to disregard the printed route and follow the updated satellite feed. I said, "Trust the sky we have, not the forecast we planned for." Ronald closed his eyes for just an instant before letting out a slow breath. "That sentence never appeared in any public report," he said quietly. "It was included only in the internal after-action review." Logan looked at Ronald. "General." Ronald nodded once before turning back to me. "I chaired part of the review board after that operation. I have not forgotten it." Logan's shoulders straightened almost instinctively. The realization spreading across his face was impossible to mistake. Every unusual detail from the afternoon had suddenly fallen into place. The specific timeline, the weather correction, the calm professionalism, the uncommon qualifications on my uniform. None of them had been coincidences. Brianna looked from one face to another, her smile fading. "Wait. What is happening?" she asked. Logan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked carefully at the decorations above my ribbons one more time before speaking with quiet sincerity. "Captain Hernandez, I owe you an apology." I tilted my head slightly. "For what?" "For assuming I was speaking with someone who had simply read about those operations." I offered a small smile. "It is an understandable assumption." He slowly shook his head. "No, it was not. I should have recognized what I was seeing much earlier." Brianna laughed nervously. "Logan, you are acting like she is some kind of celebrity." He turned toward his new wife with surprising gentleness. "No, I am acting like I have finally recognized a fellow officer whose service deserves respect." The nearby conversations gradually became quieter as a few guests sensed something meaningful was unfolding. Nobody appeared alarmed. They were simply curious why the groom had become so serious in the middle of the reception. Ronald looked at me warmly. You never mentioned your role. Nobody asked, I replied honestly. And today is not about me. Ronald smiled. That answer tells me even more than your record ever could. Logan nodded in agreement. Most people would have corrected everyone the moment they were underestimated. That would not have helped my sister enjoy her wedding, I answered. Brianna folded her arms. I still do not understand why everyone suddenly looks so impressed. Logan looked at her kindly rather than critically. Because some of the details your sister casually mentioned this afternoon were known only to the people who planned one of the most respected rescue operations of the last decade. Brianna stared at him in disbelief before turning back toward me. Isla, is that actually true? Before I could answer, Ronald reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and carefully removed an old leather card holder. From inside it he unfolded a small, slightly worn photograph that had clearly been carried for years. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it with quiet appreciation before extending it toward Logan. Take a look, he said. Logan accepted the photograph carefully. His eyes widened almost immediately. The image showed a rescue command center filled with maps, weather displays, and exhausted aircrew after the Alaska mission. Standing at the center of the room, still wearing flight gear and speaking to multiple teams at once, was a younger version of me. Across the bottom of the photograph, handwritten in dark blue ink, were the words, "To General Sanchez. Thank you for believing in our team. Respectfully, Isla Hernandez." Logan slowly raised his eyes from the photograph to my face while Ronald quietly added, "There is one more thing about Captain Hernandez that almost nobody outside the review board knows, and once everyone here hears it, this entire room is going to understand why today was never about a uniform at all." I looked at General Sanchez with quiet surprise, unsure what he intended to say next. I had never enjoyed being the subject of attention, especially during someone else's celebration, and the last thing I wanted was for Brianna's wedding to become centered on my career. Before I could politely change the subject, General Sanchez addressed Logan in a calm voice that carried naturally across the nearby tables. "Captain Hernandez never requested recognition for that mission," he said. "In fact, she declined every interview that was offered afterward." Logan looked back at the photograph and then at me. "You turned them all down?" I nodded. "The crews did the work. I happen to be responsible for making decisions. That does not make me the story." General Sanchez smiled warmly. That is exactly what she told every reporter. Several guests had quietly gathered within earshot by now, not because anyone had called them over, but because conversations naturally paused whenever something unexpected unfolded. Brianna stood motionless beside Logan, trying to understand why respected military officers were speaking about her sister with such admiration. General Sanchez continued, "The public remembered the rescue because 26 climbers and 4 park rangers returned home safely. What the public never learned was that another recommendation had already been approved before Captain Hernandez challenged it." Logan's expression sharpened. "The original extraction route?" "Exactly," Sanchez replied. "Every available forecast suggested one corridor." Captain Hernandez reviewed a rapidly updated satellite feed, recognized the changing conditions, and accepted full responsibility for altering the mission. Had she been wrong, her career might have ended that day. Instead, every aircraft completed its assignment safely. The surrounding guests listened in complete silence. Even the musicians preparing for the next dance paused for a moment as the room seemed to settle into respectful attention. Brianna looked at me with an expression I had not seen in years. It was not anger. It was confusion mixed with disbelief. "Why did you never tell anyone?" she asked quietly. I answered honestly, "Because that was never the important part. But everyone here is acting like..." She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence. I smiled gently. "I came here because you are my sister." Logan slowly folded the photograph and handed it back to General Sanchez with obvious care. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I think I understand now why some of those details sounded familiar. We studied that operation during one of our leadership seminars." Sanchez nodded. "Many military leaders did." Logan looked back at me. "Your decisions became case studies." I laughed softly, almost embarrassed. Operations become case studies. People simply do their jobs. Logan shook his head with genuine admiration. Very few people answer every compliment by redirecting credit somewhere else. Before I could respond, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage and invited everyone to gather for the couple's first dance. Guests slowly returned to their tables, conversations restarting in low voices, yet I could feel the atmosphere had shifted. Earlier that afternoon people had glanced toward my uniform with curiosity or amusement. Now many of those same faces looked at me with quiet respect instead. I wished they would simply return their attention to the bride and groom. During the dance, I deliberately remained near the back of the ballroom beside the large windows overlooking the ocean. I applauded with everyone else as Brianna and Logan shared their first dance as husband and wife. Watching them together reminded me that despite everything, today was still meant to celebrate the beginning of their marriage. Halfway through the song, someone quietly approached beside me. It was one of the bridesmaids who had laughed earlier near the entrance. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Captain Hernandez," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. I should not have laughed this afternoon." I smiled kindly. "It is all right." "No," she replied, "it really is not. I judged you without knowing anything about you. We all make quick assumptions sometimes." She nodded gratefully before returning to the dance floor. Her apology was sincere, and somehow that meant more than any public recognition could have. A few minutes later another guest approached to thank me for my service. Then an elderly veteran quietly shook my hand without saying much at all. None of the interactions lasted long, but together they reflected something much more meaningful than admiration. They reflected understanding. Across the room, Brianna noticed each conversation. I could see questions building behind her eyes even as she smiled through photographs with friends and relatives. Eventually the music ended to loud applause. Logan thanked everyone before excusing himself from the dance floor. Instead of heading toward the bar or greeting another table, he walked directly over to me. His posture became noticeably more formal than it had been all afternoon. He stopped about an arm's length away and said in a steady voice, "Captain Hernandez, there is something I believe should have happened the moment I recognized your record." Before I could answer, he slowly straightened his shoulders, his expression becoming unmistakably professional. Guests nearest us began falling silent once again as they sensed something unusual was about to happen, while Brianna turned toward us from the center of the ballroom just in time to see Logan preparing to do something that left her completely speechless. Logan stopped directly in front of me, his shoulders squared with the unmistakable bearing of an officer addressing another service member. The conversations nearest us gradually faded as guests sensed that something meaningful was unfolding. Without a trace of hesitation, he looked me in the eye and spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Captain Hernandez, I should have recognized your service much sooner, and I sincerely apologize for my assumptions." Before I could answer, he slowly raised his right hand in a formal military salute. It was not theatrical. It was not exaggerated. It was a simple, precise gesture of professional respect from one officer to another. For a heartbeat the ballroom became completely still. I immediately returned the salute with equal professionalism before lowering my hand. "Thank you, Captain Pierce," I replied quietly. "Your respect is appreciated, but today belongs to you and Brianna." Logan smiled with genuine humility. Showing respect never takes anything away from a wedding. It honors the values that make a marriage worth celebrating. Around us, several veterans attending the reception instinctively straightened their posture. An elderly Marine quietly placed one hand over his heart. A retired Coast Guard commander gave a respectful nod from across the room. No one applauded immediately because the moment felt too sincere to interrupt. Then a few guests softly clapped, followed by others, not because they had witnessed a performance, but because they finally understood what my uniform represented. Brianna stood frozen beside the dance floor, her bouquet still resting in her hands. She had expected the attention to return to the celebration after the first dance, yet instead she was watching her new husband publicly honor the very sister she had mocked only hours earlier. Our mother looked equally stunned, her eyes moving between Logan and me as though she were trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the day. I quietly stepped closer to Logan and lowered my voice. "Please do not let this become the focus of your reception." He nodded respectfully. "I understand. Then he turned toward the guests and smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we should continue celebrating my beautiful wife. The room relaxed almost immediately. Music resumed, conversations returned, and servers continued moving between tables. It was handled with exactly the kind of maturity I had hoped for. For several minutes everything felt almost normal again. I slipped outside onto the terrace overlooking the Atlantic, grateful for a little fresh air. The late afternoon sunlight reflected across the water, while the steady sound of waves replaced the chatter from inside the ballroom. I rested my hands lightly on the stone railing and allowed myself a slow breath. Keeping my promise to my father had been more difficult than I ever expected, but I would have made the same choice again without hesitation. A few moments later I heard soft footsteps behind me. Brianna walked onto the terrace alone, still wearing her wedding gown, though her confident expression from earlier had completely disappeared. She stopped several feet away before speaking. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked quietly. I looked toward the ocean before answering. "You never asked." She lowered her eyes. "I thought I knew everything about your career." I smiled gently. "You knew that I served. That was enough for me." She shook her head slowly. "No, it was not enough. I kept assuming your uniform was just a job. I never imagined." Her voice trailed away. "You never needed to imagine anything," I said softly. "I came today because you are my sister. That has always mattered more than my career." She looked at me with tears beginning to gather in her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away to protect her makeup before the evening photographs. "I made fun of you in front of everyone," she whispered. "You did. Why did you stay?" I answered without hesitation. "Because leaving would have broken the promise I made to Dad." The mention of our father seemed to affect her more deeply than anything else that had happened all afternoon. She looked down at her wedding ring for several silent seconds before speaking again. "I remember him telling us that uniforms were never about showing off. He said they reminded people to serve before themselves." She nodded faintly. "I forgot." Before I could respond, the ballroom doors opened once more. General Sanchez stepped onto the terrace carrying a small cream-colored envelope in one hand. "Captain Hernandez," he called gently. "I believe this belongs to you." I looked at the envelope in surprise. Written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting were just 4 words. "For Isla on weddings." My heart skipped. I had never seen the envelope before. General Sanchez smiled warmly. "Your father gave this to me several years ago after a veterans charity event. He told me that if I ever happened to attend a wedding where you were present, and if the timing felt right, I should make certain you received it." Brianna stared at the envelope in disbelief as I carefully accepted it with both hands. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, and as I slowly slipped one finger beneath the sealed flap, I realized that whatever message he had left inside had been waiting years to be opened at this exact moment. My hands remained steady as I carefully opened the envelope, but inside I could already feel the familiar weight of my father's presence. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and the careful handwriting across the folded letter instantly carried me back to evenings when he would sit at the kitchen table writing birthday cards or leaving encouraging notes before I deployed. Brianna stepped closer without saying a word. Logan and General Sanchez remained respectfully several feet away, giving us privacy while still sharing the moment. I unfolded the letter slowly and began reading aloud because somehow it felt wrong to keep my father's final message to myself. "My dear Isla, if you are reading this at your sister's wedding, then life has continued exactly as I hoped it would. That means our family has laughed together again, cried together again, and kept moving forward even after I was no longer there to remind everyone what matters. First, thank you for keeping your promise. I know you well enough to believe that if I asked you to wear your uniform, you would honor that request no matter how uncomfortable it became. Never wear that uniform because it impresses people. Wear it because it reminds you of the promise you made to serve people you will probably never meet. That promise is worth more than medals, promotions, or applause." I paused for a moment as emotion caught in my throat before continuing. "Second, if your sister becomes overwhelmed on her wedding day, forgive her before she asks. Weddings carry joy, but they also carry pressure. People sometimes say foolish things when they are trying too hard to create a perfect day. Do not let one difficult afternoon become a lifelong distance between the two of you. You only get one sister. Treasure her even when she forgets to treasure you. By the time I reached the next paragraph, Brianna quietly covered her mouth with one hand. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks, and for the first time that entire day she made no attempt to hide them. I continued reading. Brianna, if Isla is reading this aloud, then I hope you are standing beside her. I have always admired your confidence, but confidence without humility eventually becomes loneliness. Never measure your sister by what she chooses not to say. The strongest people I have ever known rarely announce their strength. They simply live it. If you ever discover that your little sister has accomplished more than you realized, celebrate her instead of comparing yourself to her. There will always be enough love in this family for both of you. Neither of us could speak for several seconds. The ocean breeze gently moved the edges of the letter while memories of our father seemed to surround us more clearly than ever before. I swallowed carefully before reading the final section. Finally, remember something I tried to teach both of you when you were children. Character is revealed by how you treat people before you know who they are. Respect offered only after recognition is easy. Respect offered without expecting anything in return is what truly honors another human being. If you both remember that lesson, then I will never really be gone. Love each other. Be patient with each other. And whenever possible, choose grace before pride. Love always, Dad. I slowly folded the letter, unable to say anything else. Brianna stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me without hesitation. I embraced her just as tightly. Neither of us cared that tears had ruined part of her makeup, or that photographers inside might be waiting for the next reception event. At that moment we were simply two sisters who missed their father. I am so sorry, she whispered through tears. I was embarrassed by the wrong things. I spent the whole day worrying about appearances when Dad only wanted us to remember who we were. I gently brushed a tear from her cheek. You do not have to apologize forever. One sincere apology is enough. She shook her head. I laughed at you before I knew the truth. I smiled softly. Dad already answered that. Character is how we treat people before we know who they are. We both heard the lesson. She nodded slowly. I want to do better. Then you already have. Logan quietly approached, giving Brianna a gentle smile before looking at me. Captain Hernandez, thank you for sharing that letter with us. It belonged to all of us, I replied. General Sanchez added warmly, your father understood leadership better than many officers I have known. We all shared a quiet laugh, and the heaviness that had filled the afternoon slowly gave way to peace. A wedding coordinator stepped onto the terrace and apologized for interrupting. Everyone is ready for the family photograph whenever you are. Brianna looked at me hopefully. Will you stand beside me? I smiled. I was always planning to. We walked back into the ballroom together. This time as we entered, nobody stared at my uniform. Nobody whispered. Nobody pointed. They simply smiled. During the family photographs, Brianna insisted that I stand immediately beside her while Logan stood on her other side. Our mother quietly reached for my hand before the photographer counted down. I should have listened to your father too, she said softly. I forgot that a uniform represents service, not attention. I squeezed her hand gently. We all remember things at different times. The photographer captured the image just as all four of us smiled naturally. It became my favorite photograph from the entire wedding because no one in it was pretending anymore. Later that evening, after the cake had been served and the final dances had begun, I quietly gathered my small overnight bag. I never enjoyed leaving without saying goodbye, but I also did not want the reception ending with another conversation about me. As I reached the lobby, Logan caught up with me. You were really going to leave quietly? He asked with a smile. That seemed appropriate. He extended his hand once more. Thank you for honoring our wedding with your presence. I shook his hand firmly. Take good care of my sister. I will, he promised. And thank you for reminding me that the finest officers are usually the ones least interested in being recognized. Brianna hurried over a moment later and hugged me one final time. Next Sunday, she said. Family dinner. No uniforms. No wedding planning. Just us. I laughed. I would like that very much. As I walked outside beneath the warm evening sky, I looked once toward the ballroom windows where laughter and music continued inside. My father's promise had been fulfilled. I had worn my uniform not because it made me important, but because it honored the values he had spent a lifetime teaching us. Recognition had come, but it had never been the victory. The real victory was leaving with my family closer than when I arrived. As I drove away along the quiet coastal highway, I glanced once at the folded letter resting safely on the passenger seat. My father had been right all along. A uniform may reveal a profession, but kindness reveals a person, and in the end it was never rank that changed our family. It was grace.